So first, my name is Marshall Beddoe. I'm a research and development engineer for Foundstone Incorporated. My company does managed services, professional services, and security products. Today we'll be talking about the Siphon Project, which is an implementation of stealth target acquisition and information gathering methodologies. And just as a side note, all research that we conducted for this project was conducted completely independent. And Chris?
Yeah, my name is Christopher Abad. I'm also a research and development engineer for Foundstone.
And here's the contact information and the URL to our Siphon Project webpage. Here's an overview of the lecture today. We will be going into define general network mapping. Then later we will get into active mapping techniques with definitions and details. And next, passive techniques, which includes our Siphon software. What's that? Okay. And last, we will finish up with an example of a Siphon report. Prerequisite to this talk is that you know what network mapping is, and I'm sure a lot of you do, but just for formal purposes, we will define network mapping as the process of gathering information in order to identify and understand the internetworking of systems. Network mapping is important because it allows one to gather information about the network. It allows you to identify weaknesses in the network and to learn how the network operates. For a white hat, it is important because you can protect your network better if you know what is on your network. And for black hats, network mapping is important because it is the first step that they take to gain access to your network. Network mapping information that we gather through active and passive techniques includes port information, operating system information enumeration, topology map generation, and lastly, vulnerability information. I will go over each one in the following slides. Gathering port information is important because vulnerable services run on TCP and UDP ports. For example, on port 21, which is FTP, on Linux machines, there's WFTPD vulnerabilities, etc. It also allows an attacker or an administrator type to gain a perception of the security on the network or the host. If a hacker does a recon on your network and notices that all your machines have all the default ports open, then he can probably conclude that your network is not very well administered and probably will be a lot more noisy and not have to feel like he has to be as stealth. And finding open ports is also important because it allows us to perform accurate operating system identification. Gathering operating system information is important because it allows one to survey the types of operating systems on a network. Some companies run all Windows NT systems, some companies run all Linux systems. Therefore, one can take the vulnerabilities that they're looking for and narrow them down to a specific operating system, which goes into the next bullet point, which is vulnerabilities are specific to operating systems, so it allows you to only search for a certain type of vulnerability. Information enumeration can be defined as, quote, harmless information that could later lead to the compromise of a network. This information includes email addresses, NetBIOS names, network file system exports, usernames, host names, and whois information. All this stuff seems harmless. Anybody can go do a whois on your website and gain the network administrator's name, the phone number, etc., which can later be used for social engineering purposes, etc. Topology map generation is a good thing to have because it allows one to create a visual map of what that network looks like. When you understand the physical layout of a network, you can easily diagnose problems and find vulnerabilities better. It may even allow you to discover a alternate penetration route. And lastly, vulnerability information. And I think everybody knows why this is important. If you find vulnerabilities, you can break into a system. So vulnerabilities consist of all previously explained network mapping information, which includes the port mapping, the operating system identification, etc. It allows us to discover vulnerabilities on a system and in the network configuration. And this is very, very important because it only takes one vulnerability to lead to the downfall of an entire network. We will next compare and contrast the differences between active network mapping and passive network mapping. Publicly available tools for active network mapping include Nmap, which is a port scanner and OS identifier, Queso, which is also an old-style OS identifier, and Nessus, which is a vulnerability scanner. We will then get into passive network mapping, which includes the only publicly available passive network mapping software, which is our software, which is called Siphon. Active network mapping can be defined as sending queries in order to receive responses to gather port information, operating system information, etc. This requires employing applications that generate noise on the network. For example, you perform port identification, or excuse me, operating system identification using Nmap. You send out thousands of packets in hope of discovering what operating system that target machine is running. Active mapping techniques include active port mapping, active operating system identification, active information enumeration, active topology map generation, and active vulnerability assessment. This is kind of some of the details for active port mapping techniques. Nmap does all of these, I believe. TCP connect scans, TCP stealth scans, special TCP fin, Xmas, and null scans, and vanilla UDP scans. And in diagram 1, this is a simple TCP three-way handshake. The darker machine is trying to connect to the telnet port on the lighter machine. So we'll call the dark machine host A and the lighter machine host B. So host A sends a SYN packet to port 23 on host B. Since port 23 is open on host B responds with a SYN-ACK packet. Host A then follows up with a three-way handshake by responding with an ACK packet back to port 23. The TCP connect scan can probably be considered the most accurate port scan method, but it is easily logged because it is creating a full connection, so that is one downfall to it. In diagram number 2 is TCP SYN stealth scans. And in this diagram, host A sends a SYN packet to port 23 on host B. Host B responds with a SYN-ACK packet from port 23 because it is open. And instead of sending an ACK packet, host A doesn't and just makes note that port 23 is open, never completing the three-way handshake. This used to be considered stealth because of a lot of the logging mechanisms on machines would not log incomplete connections. Nowadays, IDSs pick up on this stuff, multiple operating systems log this stuff, so it's not stealth anymore. Diagram 3 is an example of a fin scan, and in this diagram, host A sends a fin packet to host B to port 23. And since no reset packet was sent from host B, host A assumes that port 23 was open. This has some accuracy problems because a reset packet could get lost, or it could time out, or something can happen, and that would mess up the results on host A and to think that port 23 was open on host B. And lastly, we have a vanilla UDP scan, which is very simple. Host A sends a simple UDP packet to port 67 on host B. No ICMP port unreachable message was received on host A, so he assumes that port 67 is open. UDP scans, probably one of the most inaccurate scans possible because a lot of routers block ICMP port unreachable messages. Active operating system identification is performed by fingerprinting the TCP advertised window, TCP options, by sending fin probes, initial sequence number sampling, and fragmentation handling. And in this diagram, it is just a TCP packet with the highlighted fields of the packet are the ones that we actually fingerprint off of. So for example, the TCP advertised window is very dynamic per operating system. On Solaris, the TCP advertised window is hex 2238, while on FreeBSD it is hex 4000. It's probably one of the most accurate fields to fingerprint off of because it is so operating system specific. Another method for OS identification includes TCP option ordering. You can send a SYN packet with TCP options set in a specific order, and some operating systems will respond a SYN-ACK packet with options in a different order. I know Solaris does this. I'm not quite sure of others, but it's not a very accurate technique. But when using combination with all these fingerprinting methods, we're able to conclude that it is, for example, a Solaris 2.6 machine rather than a Solaris 2.7 machine. Another technique is by sending fin probes, and this is not very specific at all. It's basically you can tell the difference between a Unix operating system and a Windows operating system. Unix operating systems do not send reset packets back when the port is open, while Windows systems always send a reset packet back. So you would think that if you were scanning a Windows machine, you would think that no ports were open when in actuality they are. And lastly, some operating systems set the don't fragment bit in the IP packet when responding to a regular SYN packet. It's not specific at all, but when using combination with all these, we are able to tell specifically what operating system and version it is running. While enumerating information on a network, some active techniques include NetBIOS name gathering, NetBIOS drive sharing, SendMail EXPN probes to find usernames, finger information to find usernames, WHOIS information to find out the administrator's name, contact information, phone numbers, etc. for social engineering purposes, and lastly, network file system exports. Active topology mapping, I'm going to hand this one over to Chris.
There's not too many products out there that do active topology mapping, but there's a few of them, and most of them use the method of trace routing to target hosts and taking these trace route information and building topology maps from that. Normally when you were to trace route to say host B on this, you would think that you have an account, a hop by hop account for the networks that the packet will go through, but also in this data inherently, it kind of provides us with simplistic link state between any two adjacent peers. For example, like when you trace route to host B, you're going to come up with host A to be the hop right before our end destination. But that also tells us a little information about the state of the link between host A and B, that it exists basically. And when you were to combine a single trace route or multiple trace routes to hosts, what you can build is entire graph of link state information, which describes roughly network topology. And just like in this diagram, what we have combined is a trace route to host C and also to host B. And from this, we built this graph from the information that we were able to gather from active trace routing.
Active vulnerability assessment is performed by doing banner checking, RPC port mapper queries, and DNS version queries. In this diagram is an example of banner checking. Host A is connecting to host B on port 21, which is FTP. Host B responds to host A with its version banner. And in this version banner, host B is running Washington University FTP 2.6.0, which is vulnerable to a format string bug attack. RPC port mapper queries are used to find out which RPC services are running on a machine, and lastly, DNS version queries are used to find vulnerable bind servers and stuff like that. There are a lot of pros and cons to active mapping. Active mapping is good because the assessment can be conducted from a different network. I can be at home on my home machine and I can map out any network connected to the internet. And it generally requires little time to gather the information. You can map out a class C in 10 minutes with vulnerability information, port information, operating system information, etc. The problems with active mapping is that it generates network noise. Nmap sends thousands of packets to a network, which set off intrusion detection system alarms. And sometimes it also crashes machines. So if you're a hacker and you don't want to get caught, why would you want to send out thousands of packets to a network? It also reveals the source of the probe, regardless of where you're regardless of if it's your machine or not. It still leaves fingerprints, which can be used later to catch you. And some active mapping has accuracy problems, which includes the fin scanning and the UDP scanning. And lastly, it's very intrusive. This is important even for network administrators because you want to be able to map your own network, but you don't want to be intrusive to the users on the network. Due to the pros and cons of active mapping, Chris Abad and I created the Siphon Project in January 2000. And we created it because it does not generate any network noise. We did not want a network mapping program to trigger intrusion detection system alarms. We did not want to reveal the source of our probe. We didn't even want to send out a single packet. We consider this a very stealth technique. And the idea was came into my mind when I read a paper by Cortez Giovanni on the offensive use of intrusion detection systems. And it was nothing really too special. He just kind of talked about finding open ports on a machine without sending out a single packet by monitoring SNAC packets. Me and Chris took this idea and we expanded it, and basically we were able to create a program that does everything active mapping does and more. Passive network mapping can be defined as gathering information about a network without sending out a single packet. And we're able to do this by monitoring traffic. By monitoring traffic, we can determine the entire layout of the network and the configuration of the hosts connected to the network. If you're a black hat type, you can. This is obvious why it's valuable. You don't send out a single packet. They don't even really have to know that you are there. If you're an administrator type, if you operate in a red tape environment like the U.S. military or the government, there's a lot of red tape there where you can't necessarily go out and be intrusive to your users. So by running a tool like Siphon, you would be able to map out your network. A lot of people ask me, is passive network mapping feasible? Even I've read papers by Cortez Giovanni, which was a follow-up to our first proof of concept release of Siphon, saying that passive will never be as widely used as active network mapping because it takes so long for you to gather the information, and hosts that never receive network traffic on a network might not be reported, which is true for the most part. It does provide complete informations like active mapping, but we do have more accuracy, and the only difference is that it takes more time to gather the information, and a host that never gets network traffic will not be logged. The people that would use passive network mapping are network administrators that operate in red tape environments and skilled hackers that move slowly to avoid detection. I wouldn't really believe any script kiddie could even wait to fire off his nmap instead of waiting 2-3 weeks for his results from Siphon. Siphon mapping techniques do pretty much the exact same thing as the active techniques, except we do it all passively. So we do passive port mapping, passive operating system identification, passive information enumeration, topology map generation, passive vulnerability assessment, and lastly, our report generation. Passive TCP port mapping is done quite simply. Basically, we just monitor SNAC packets and log the source port of the machine that sent out that SNAC packet. So in this diagram, we have host A connecting to port 23 on host B. So we send a SYN packet to port 23 on host B. Host B responds with the SYN-ACK packet, and host A follows up with a handshake and sends back an ACK packet. Now our software is on the wire of one of these machines, and sees the SYN-ACK packet come back from port 23. So our software can determine that port 23 is open on host B. It's pretty basic. There are some problems with TCP port mapping, but we came up with a solution. And the problem is that a malicious, or maybe not so malicious administrator could corrupt the information database by spoofing SYN-ACK packets. And to combat this problem, we actually monitor the TCP state of all the connections on the network. And Chris will go into this a bit more about the internals of our software.
Yeah, like you said, real easy way for someone to like defeat sniffing and monitoring open ports passively would be to just like flood your network with bogus SYN-ACKs that look like a connection was being established and accepted by a host. So basically what we're doing is stateful monitoring of TCP connections like any IDS or firewall might want to do. And other problems that arise from keeping state is just the amount of traffic generated on like high traffic networks could cause our software to take up a lot of CPU. So there's just methods that we implemented to combat this with our using hash lookup tables to maintain the state, and that's what we're actually doing, is using like a probabilistic TCP state keeping algorithm, where we just perform a hash function on the TCP packets upon SYN, and then try to match that same hash upon a SYN ACK to verify whether a connection was valid.
Yeah, one thing I forgot was to describe this diagram. In this diagram, host C is just blindly sending out SYN ACK packets, spoofing host A's IP address and from port 666. Traditionally, our software would be tricked into thinking that host A has port 666 open, when this is not the case. So due to our TCP state monitoring, we're able to combat this problem completely. Yes. Yes, if you wanted to get tricky, of course you can spoof a whole three-way connection, but who's really going to do that much, you know? But that would trick anything. It won't just trick ours, per se. Yes? No, that should not have, there's... Yeah.
Are you referring to like a temporary port that might be open for some type of connection, or what exactly are you referring to there? Yeah. On some like random like high port or something? Well, yeah, we'll see that come up, but then we'll be able to, we'll get into that a little later as far as ports usage statistics go in identifying a server's role, and that's how we address that kind of issue as far as like randomly used high ports for certain protocols. All right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as going on to active mapping and intrusion techniques on the local LAN already? Yeah, well, you're already on. We don't, regardless of how you're on, we're not trying to address that issue. But what you're still going to do is still generate more traffic on the LAN to signify your presence there. Whereas here, even if you are on the LAN, you're not going to increase your risks per se, as far as being identified on the LAN.
Do you have a wireless network card? Do you have a wireless network card? Okay, well, for those that do, go drive into a parking lot of some company and jump on their network and plug in Siphon, and they won't even know that you're there. So that's also a good application of passive network mapping. Next, we do passive UDP port mapping, and this can be done just like active does, but basically waiting for the other host to send the packet rather than you send the packet. So our software will monitor UDP packets and then listen for ICMP port unreachables. Big problems with this because it's not very accurate. Some ICMP port unreachables sometimes don't get past firewalls, etc., so we might falsely assume that a port is open. So in order to combat this problem, we actually decode application layer protocols that use UDP. For example, host A is doing a DNS query to UDP port 53 on host B. Host B responds with a DNS query response from UDP port 53, and our software will actually decode this DNS query response, and we'll be able to determine that it is a name server, and it is resolving names, so therefore port 53 must be open. I'm going to hand this one over to Chris. He wrote the algorithm.
Oh, yeah, passive OS identification. Originally, you might have seen a paper by this. I believe Lance Spitzner did a small paper on this about the same time when we were developing this. So there's a lot of syncing going on there. But basically, passive OS identification is pretty much drastically different than active identification because we don't really get to form and craft the packets to send out in order to receive certain responses we're looking for, as he described earlier, in how active fingerprinting works. Instead, we have to rely on connections that are occurring, and a lot of problems come up with that because there's a lot of ways a machine could actually initiate a TCP connection as far as certain options being set go. But there's a few points that we are always using in passive OS identification in the TCP packets and like also the IP headers is first we're going to monitor the TCP SYNAC packets upon connection establishment, and we're basing our OS fingerprints upon a TCP advertise window, which active mapping does use, but is able to craft its packets in a way that it will get responses that it expects back most of the time. And the IP don't fragment bit, as he explained, is also used. The default TTL is also used. We have to estimate that by methods like rounding up to like the nearest binary value, like 32, 64, 128, which is a guess, but that's how operating system identification is a guess anyways, so we really don't take that into account as a con here. And the TCP options, such as especially the MSS TCP options set by the connecting host, because the connecting host is able to get the server to change its TCP window, we've noticed, depending on whether the TCP MSS option is set or not, and what the MSS value is set to. And right here we have a diagram of a basic SYNAC connection here. And you see Siphon machine at the bottom. And what's being sent to the host C from host A, the connecting host, is a SYN request to open a connection on port 23. And then the SYNAC coming back with a source port of 23 saying, OK. And we have a TCP advertise window, a hex OX4000. The don't fragment bit is on. And the TTL is set to 60, default TTL we estimate to be 64. If this was on a local network, that would be actually the value we saw in the packet itself. And when we look that up, it happens to be FreeBSD there. And there's some other challenges here for passive OS identification. As I said, the TCP window as well as other fields change a lot. So here you see multiple fingerprints for the single operating system or ranges within the version. And we have to take into account for this to simplify these fingerprints. We came up with a method to condense these fingerprints into a single fingerprint. And right here, what we do is basically take a group of windows that are known that the system might send out, and then we create like a few masks, a bit mask, a legal bit mask. We basically logically AND all the windows together to see what bits are consistently set in the windows, which we could use as a filter. We just will AND that mask with the window that is being sent to see if any bits fall outside of our legal range. And the static bit masks are bits that are always set in any window. So if any bits aren't set in the window that we have determined to always be set, we also have a non-match. And then this bottom part just explains that we have a little leeway here. When we get a window, we compare it with the legal bits, verify that, compare it with the static bits, verify that, and if there are any discrepancies there, we are able to make an estimation of how far off this matches from the fingerprint we recorded by taking like a Hamming count of the two windows and then the window in our fingerprint file. And the closer that is to matching, like the more determination we can make of whether this is the proper operating system we try to identify. And right here, after applying our algorithm, you see we have like a single fingerprint here where you see the static bit value and the legal bit value, and then the rest of the information, TTL, the don't fragment bit, and then like a little text label of what the operating system is.
All right, we are also able to perform passive information enumeration, and this is quite simple stuff. It's basically just setting up a sniffer. We are able to enumerate information by monitoring telnet traffic to gather usernames and passwords. We also monitor incoming mail traffic to gather usernames. We monitor incoming web traffic to gather host names. We also monitor DNS queries and responses to gather host names because we do want to be able to resolve IP addresses with our software, but we don't want to actually have to go do that DNS query on that same network because you're actually performing something active. So basically what we do is we monitor DNS queries and we keep them in a table, and later when we do our report generation, we look up that IP address in that table and we're able to tell what the host name is. We also monitor file sharing, like network file system and NetBIOS. So we're able to, you want to take the NetBIOS one? Sorry. So that's pretty basic. And we also perform traffic analysis to find peak hours, low hours, etc. This might be valuable to an attacker for him to choose when he feels it's best to be on the network. And lastly, we do network hardware fingerprinting. And this is something that's just kind of fun, you know, just to tell that host A has a 3COM network card or something like that. Maybe even wireless access points later on. And we also perform passive topology mapping in a way that active completely falls short. And we do this by monitoring dynamic routing protocols. We monitor the routing information protocol, which is a general distance vector protocol. And we monitor open shortest path first protocols, which is a link state protocol. And the OSPF is really easy for us to do, but we'll get into that a little later. And we are also to kind of estimate how the network is laid out by performing TTL estimation, and we just call this path vector routing topology. So I'm going to hand this to Chris.
Yeah, I'll just give you a brief overview. We don't really intend to like give you a good detailed explanation of these routing protocols, but just a guideline of where the information is useful and what information is useful. Routing the RIP protocol, RIP protocol, everyone knows. It's interior gateway protocol, meaning it just describes rough network in like a certain zone. And it's a distance vector protocol, which means it doesn't describe the actual topology of a network, but it describes how far your intended host is away from where you are. Or any other type of metric you want to use. It could be like how costly it is this to send this packet from host A to B, any way of optimizing your path. And it sends routing update messages frequently, which is good for us because we don't have to wait too long for this information to appear. So this, like, if you're on a RIP network, this is pretty much instantaneous network information we could gather. And for further information on this protocol, you could reference these RFCs that we've noted here at that last bullet point. And topology mapping with RIP. We could actually estimate with like a small degree of the network layout in general with the data inside a RIP packet by monitoring RIP packets on multiple subnets running Siphon. And we'll run it through a link state. We'll run it through a distance vector to like a link state routing conversion method, which basically takes multiple RIP advertisements and kind of syncs them together to estimate how far certain networks are from networks we have Siphon running on, and also to build a general topology of where networks lie. Not necessarily how target hosts are connected peer-to-peer, but general network diagrams. Oh yeah, here's how we do that. Man, I haven't looked at this for a while. Inside RIP packets, inherently, it describes almost the same type of data that a trace route might provide, except for instead of telling you peer-to-peer connections, it'll definitely tell you direct default gateways or gateways that are one hop away inside the packets, because inside a RIP advertisement, you basically have a target network and then the cost to that network. Generally nowadays, that metric is distance. And that information right away is not too detailed, but in combining this with other subnets, RIP information, we'll be able to build a real rough graph from this, and I'll kind of explain how that works. If we were to sniff two RIP protocol packets, we have this method of, like I said, of combining this data to form an estimate of what the network looks like. And without getting too detailed how it works, I'll just basically give you a real simple example how that might work. Is if we picked up traffic and decoded a RIP protocol packet, and we had some network B out there somewhere that we know is 3 hops away from network A we're sniffing on, and then we have another network we're sniffing on, network C, and it says it's 7 away, we're able to know that network, the distance between these two networks can only range between 3 hops and 10 hops away, because here's a better, it's hard to visualize what I'm talking about, but here's a better example of that visually for you. What we have at the top are 2 RIP broadcasts on the left from network 1 to network 1 is 0, obviously a metric of 0, to network 2, metric of 2, 3 is 5, and then from network 2 to the same networks, it has different metrics because it might be a different distance away. We have 2, it's obviously 0 away from itself, 7, 7, and 5. And then below here, what we created from these 2 RIP broadcasts are actually what looks like a connected a matrix, which describes a connected graph or a network. And below is the minimum and maximum distances each network might be away from each other. And what we'll do with these is combine them to narrow down these distances. The closer we get these distances down to a single value, the better idea of what the network topology might look like. And what we have here on the next page is, after we condense those 2 matrices together, we have right here a better description of what the network might look like. And from this matrix, you could easily generate a connected graph from it. Now, this is a much easier protocol to take and convert it into a link state information or exact topology graph, because that's exactly what the OSPF protocol does. That's one of its pros over a distance vector protocol, is right there. It's designed to correct problems associated with RIP. One of the problems is exact network topology. Basically, that's why it's called a link state protocol. It learns the routing information through link state advertisements, LSAs, which are exactly descriptions of a connected graph, or which describes a network. And this information includes interface status, metrics between networks, and a topological database is maintained by the collection of LSAs receives. So basically, from the OSPF information broadcast, we really have to do no deduction here. It gives for us the exact topology of any autonomous zone. And all routers in the same area have the same topological database. They have to if they're going to describe the same topology. So this is inherent in the protocol. Topology mapping with OSPF is, like I said, relatively a simplistic concept, even though the protocol itself is pretty large. Periodic full LSA updates are broadcasted over a network. These are generally what we're looking for. And we generate topology maps based off these LSA updates because in these LSAs, like I said, what it's basically sending is just a matrix of host-to-host connections or network-to-network connections, which translates directly into a topology map or a graph. And this little diagram just gives us a little network topology view that you'll see later in our reports.
All right. Lastly, for passive network mapping, we perform vulnerability assessment without sending out a single packet. Our software does this by analyzing packet payload. We look for banner information. We look for RPC port mapper queries. We look for DNS version queries, and we also look for HTTP GET requests for CGI type vulnerabilities. This is very basic. It can be done with a simple sniffer and a database of known vulnerabilities. This diagram shows a banner check type vulnerability assessment. Host A is connecting to port 21 on host B. Host B responds with its FTP version banner, and our software is in promiscuous mode and listening for that packet, and is able to match up that banner to a database of known vulnerabilities. So our software will tag host B as vulnerable to the WOOF-TPD 2.6.0 format string attack.
This is one feature here. Traffic analysis is something that there's like no match paradigm in active scanning that can fulfill this role, and this is something you can only do by passive mapping. This is a definite pro for people like network administrators of large networks who don't really understand what role certain machines play on their network if it's large enough. And this is proven easily by why we even have assessment security companies in the first place, because network administrators really don't have a grasp on their own network. One very useful, immediately useful information we're gathering from traffic analysis is port statistics to determine a server's role on the network. Nmap can't do this. You might be able to find what ports are open on a machine. A host name might hint at what this server's role plays on the network, like if the host name is www or mail or something, we could assume that that's what it does, but that isn't absolute guarantee at all. So what we can do is build port statistics of which ports on a certain host are accessed the most. And for example, if we have a large sum of traffic to a machine on port 25 with no host name, that would hint that it's a mail server, that we could determine that that's definitely the mail server because there's so much traffic generated on that port. You can't do that with an active assessment tool. Auditing logins, email, and web access can determine user behavioral patterns and machine roles. Because if we're able to, for some reason, get a user's password and username to access the network, our context on that network may not match up with what that user actually does. So if an attacker is able to determine when this user's on the network, what machines they log into commonly, and most often, we're able to mimic with a reasonable degree of accuracy how this user uses the network. So from a black hat perspective, if you could mimic a user on the network, that's a definite plus. For an administrator, we could monitor if certain users are using the network at times they shouldn't, or any strange type of activity like that. Analysis on initial sequence numbers and other similar challenge protocol fields can reveal the nature of a host's probabilistic random number generator. This is data you've seen maybe by a paper by Zalewski and Simple Nomad on visualizing random number generators. And this starts to tend to lend itself to new methods of operating system and software fingerprinting other than your standard fingerprinting methods you have out there, like the Fyodor's OS fingerprinting, and even our own and Lance Spittner's method of operating system identification. This is a new alternative that's starting to appear more and more by estimating the randomness of a system to determine its operating system. And right down at the bottom of the bullet points right there, assistance in operating system identification and TCP sequence guessing. That's a topic that's been hot for a long time. And if you sit there sniffing a network, like right away, you know that sequence guessing is like kind of out the window. But we keep in mind we are monitoring machines that aren't necessarily a local machine. We're going to pick up traffic from people going out to Yahoo and things like that, other hosts external of the local LAN that we'll possibly be able to monitor. So if we could get this additional assistance on external machines. You have a question? Yeah, we're also collecting information, just to point out, we're collecting information not only on machines on the local LAN we're sniffing, but also machines that people access exterior to that local LAN. So there's possible here for spidering out on the network possibly and compromising other hosts. Question? Oh, defensive value? Yeah, well, this spawned from, yeah. Defense, you're talking about defense value from whose perspective? Just so I know what context we're talking. Mm-hmm. You don't see it? Well, yeah, you're right from that perspective. It doesn't lend itself too much to, if you're a system administrator, it really doesn't help you as much as it might help a hacker. But maybe you could think of a way to protect against this. I'm not a defense man, so like any ideas in that area, it's great. Yeah, that is true, and that is so common of like Fortune companies, definitely. They don't know what's on their network at all. Exactly. But yeah, you're right. Other programs do the same type of features, but here's another. Yeah, they don't do decoding. They don't. Where does one of these tools do this PRNG? But you're right. I really can't support a network administrator's ideology as much as the black hats. Yeah, all like the old Solaris machines. Yeah, a lot of people run into that. Oh, the Solaris machine's down because we ran Nmap against it. But yeah, not to deviate. Yeah. Yeah, see, that's a good point. I really didn't right here where I was talking about auditing logins and user behavioral patterns, you need to, at some point, check and balance your own administrators. If you have like a hierarchy of administrators, you can't tell me that you don't know a corrupt administrator out there that you need to have checks and balances against. And that's the perfect way to do that. And he's going to give you here like a report of what kind of information you could expect to get out of our tool.
Okay, this is an example of a Siphon report that was dynamically created by our report generation engine in our software. This is not a very big report or anything. This was just our software was run on our own personal LAN for 1 day, 25 minutes, and 13 seconds. And we only have 3 machines on the network, and all 3 of them were used. So actually, there's 4, excuse me, including the router. So we were actually able to map them out. So it's organized into host reports, and later it gets into network information. So first line, host reports. I don't know if anybody can see that very well, but the IP address is 10.0.1.1, and the host name on there is router.gravitino.net. Server type, it's a default gateway. We're just assuming that. The operating system is Linux 2.2.14, and the network card that is in the machine is a 3COM. The next line is arthusa.gravitino.net. Its IP address is 10.0.1.2. We were able to actually determine that this server is a mail server by looking at port 25 over here and noting that it was connected to 100 times while other ports were only connected to 10 times and 1 time and 1 time. It's a Linux 2.2.14 machine, and it's also running a 3COM NIC. So we also did some information, or our software also did some information enumeration and organized them this way. So we will look at the information that was enumerated by monitoring telnet traffic. So here's the telnet information for arthusa.gravitino.net. The banner says Red Hat Linux Release 6.2 Zoot. The kernel is 2.4.1, and it is a 686 machine. And we were actually able to sniff some passwords and some timestamps of the logins, and username bind, password funny, and username AMPRI, and password hilarious. These were obviously changed. But by keeping the timestamp, we can actually monitor user behavior and track users all over the network. We also enumerated information from the mail port 25. Its banner is arthusa.gravitino.net running SendMail 8.9.3. The email that was received on the machine went to bind@gravitino.net. And what's that? Highlight? Great idea. No, oh, yeah, 1 second. Windows. Oops. It's nasty. Okay. Yeah, it didn't really help, but I'll just describe it as you go along. Email addresses, email was sent to bind@gravitino.net, AMPRI@gravitino.net, Eugene@gravitino.net, Pandora@gravitino.net, and AWR@gravitino.net. So we are able to determine that all of these accounts exist on this machine and possibly on other machines connected to this network. And lastly, on this host, we enumerated some RPC information. This might not be done that often unless explicit RPC info requests were actually sent out to this host. So passively, we were able to determine that that port mapper was running, RPC.status was running, Mount D was running, and lastly, NFS was running, and the ports that they were each running on, since they were used most likely for NFS. Next line, we have IP address 10.0.1.3. Its host name is chiba.gravitino.net. We were able to determine that it was a web server because port 80 was connected to 1,000 times. Its operating system is OpenBSD 2.9. And we also were able to enumerate some information on each of these ports. For SSH, all we pretty much did was grab the SSH banner, which can lead to maybe vulnerabilities being discovered, et cetera. And maybe even later we'll do some SSH traffic analysis. The possibilities are endless. And we were able to tell that these virtual servers were hosted from chiba.gravitino.net, which is www.gravitino.net, gunmetal.dk, and hackerinrussian.net. The last host on the network is 10.0.12. Its hostname is wintermute.gravitino.net. Its server type was unknown, and we weren't able to conclude what type of server it was because there was not enough information available. Its network card is a Sun Microsystems network card, and it is running Solaris 2.6 to 2.8, one of those. So we were able to enumerate a username and grab the banner for Telnet on the system. We have a username that was sniffed, username Solaris, password Sun4U, and a timestamp. It's pretty basic. What's that? Here's the port mapper information that was passively gathered by RPC info requests. And this host has RPC bind, port mapper status, and calendar manager. And on this host, there was actually a vulnerability found. So in red, we have a little vulnerabilities found page. So on this host, we were actually able to determine that this Solaris machine is vulnerable to the calendar manager buffer overflow. And that was just based off of the port mapper enumeration. Here's the network information. Is RIP in use? No, it is not. It's a small network at home. I don't think we have the need for that. OSPF protocol is not in use. There's no multicast groups being used. And here is a very simple generated topology map of the network. And it's just a regular class C with the internet, our router, and our nodes on the network, which is 10.0.1.2 is a Red Hat machine. It has a little Red Hat logo, and .12 Solaris Sun logo, and .3 is OpenBSD. So those are that's a very minimal example of what our software can do. Go run this on a huge network, and you'll have a huge topology map, and you'll probably have a lot more information than this. But it might take a bit longer to gather all the information. Right now, our software is for, we developed it under FreeBSD. It works on Linux, all the BSDs, etc. But what's in the works is a Windows 2000 version with a GUI and all that fun stuff. Not looking forward to that, though. Some future features of Siphon include non-TCP operating system fingerprinting. I mean, who knows, we might implement some Ophir Arkin's ICMP operating system fingerprinting techniques. Maybe we won't. We're also adding default installation fingerprinting, and this will just be a minor change to our reporting engine. And basically what this means is that we will create a fingerprint for say like a default Red Hat 7.0 install. It has these ports open, this kernel is running, etc. So we'll be able to, in our reports, we'll be able to determine if a system was installed on the network and left alone, which can allow an administrator or an attacker to basically think that that machine is vulnerable and misconfigured because it's a default install. And this is kind of cool. I've only been working on this for about a week now, but we're thinking about passive wireless LAN sniffing. This will require kernel modifications, etc., for FreeBSD at least, because we want to grab the 802.11 frames. But some of the features that we're thinking about building in the Siphon include rogue access point detection, SSID gathering, and network statistics, signal strength, access points, triangulation, etc. Possibly even building some GPS type feature in there. We're also we've been working on this for about a year now and just haven't got around to it, but the OSPF integration, it's a pretty large protocol and we don't really have a network to test it out on, so it's the development for OSPF integration is very, very slow. Hopefully if anybody out here has any resources that we could tap into, we definitely appreciate that. And lastly, we also have a Windows 2000 version that is in the works. Yes. Yeah. Right now, it's kind of just like up in the air. So if anybody here has any suggestions on the way to organize this data, we'd find it very helpful. We actually were originally going to just log our data in an ASCII format. Ridiculous, that's all I have to say. Very, very long reports, and the topology maps were very nasty, so we went to HTML, dynamically generating JPEGs, etc. So if anybody does have any ideas on how to store this information, it'd be greatly appreciated. So here's the summary of everything that we talked about today. Active and passive network mapping are different in nature depending on the purpose and motivation of the user. If you want to map out your network quick without really, with disregarding the type of machines on the network and intrusion detection systems, then active network mapping is probably for you. If you want to be stealth and not be caught and not be intrusive to the users connected to the network, then I would recommend passive network mapping. Okay, passive network mapping is performed by monitoring network traffic without sending out a single packet, while active network mapping is performed by sending out queries and gathering responses, generating massive amounts of network noise, crashing machines, and setting off IDS alarms. I don't see too many downfalls to the passive side, other than the fact that you need to kind of be on the network to do it. You gotta have skill. And here's our contact information, our email addresses, and the URL to our project, where you can download our software. And as a note, the software that is included on your Black Hat CD was proof of concept software that was probably written about 1.5 years ago. It doesn't really do anything special in comparison to what we've presented today. It does passive port mapping and passive operating system identification. It's still kind of fun. You can detect operating systems without having to use Nmap, just by using your web browser and going to websites and being able to figure out what operating system it's running. But if anybody has any comments or anything like that, we'd greatly appreciate them. And is there any questions? Yes. The current version is not on that website yet. We're still deciding if we're going to open source it or not. So for all you Linux people out there, you probably hate us. Yes. Yes, it does that. We have a lot of infrastructure that we need to implement on our website for submitting fingerprints and stuff like that. But that will all be in the works quite soon. We're also thinking about creating kind of a distributed project for people to take our Siphon software and putting them on nodes that they feel it's appropriate for them to actually share that information. They will send us their Siphon logs, and we will consolidate them and possibly generate maps based on each and every person's network information that has been gathered. Is there any other questions? No, we have not. But yeah, no, we have not. But it shouldn't really apply. Yeah. The software will be available soon, so just check for updates, and you guys can go ahead and play around with it. And if there's any problems or if there's any suggestions, just email us and we'll consider it. Oh, we have to give a book away, so Chris, why don't you ask like a math question? Okay. Well, I guess we're supposed to give it to someone who asked the question for us. So I think the guy that, okay, one more question. Yes? If you use some active techniques such as ARP redirection, stuff like that, yes, you can. Yeah, we get that question all the time. If you're up for actually sending out ARP packets to redirect all the network traffic to you and then forward that to the gateway, yeah, you can do that. But with wireless nowadays, the possibilities are endless. So yes? Yes, let Chris take that.
Like, in what regard? Like, what other broadcast information might you be talking about? Oh yeah, things like that are taken into account. Like as far as IGMP multicast group registration goes, yeah, we keep track of who's in what group. When machines boot up, sometimes they'll send out like a net BIOS information that we could pick up, like whether this machine just came online, things like that. Switches, if they're flooded, sometimes they'll send out like a funky packet that fakes a collision to say whether this occurred, just to show the collision might have occurred. And yeah, we pick up that kind of thing. Oh, yeah, I'll pick up things like managed hubs just because there's like really no discrepancy. If a managed hub has services running plain text or even on that network, of course it's going to be picked up. As far as their OS or their hardware switches will be picked up, their Mac will be picked up, and their OS can be identified. Like Cisco, that's like a really good example. Cisco like switches have like TCP ports that are open sometimes that'll identify that operating system. Yeah, we have, per example, like a spam port, things like that. If someone had the time to do that, really, I don't plan on doing that today, But and especially, I don't plan on getting a license from Cisco. Things like proprietary like that, no.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we have like 30 minutes left, so I'm not going to try to keep any of you too long. But just for a time killer, I guess I'll just let you guys know what we have available at our website. And shit, I think we actually have a wireless card that we could use to go there. But some of the tools that we have available are that were just added is Adore BSD. I don't know if any of you have ever played with the Adore Linux kernel rootkit by Team Teso. But that was just ported to FreeBSD. We have Sentinel, which is a promiscuous detection program and can actually be used to detect nodes running in promiscuous mode. So you could actually detect Siphon using our other software product, which is kind of funny. We also have, I added this, but I added a tool called Guile, and that does local and remote binary backdooring. And what else do we have? Format string exploit generators. And we have some papers on some cryptography stuff that Chris has put together. So if any of you are interested in that, write down the URL and give us a visit. So thank you very much.